If heaven could receive mail, to whom would your love letter to grief be about? Welcome, everyone. I'm Tiffany, your Love Letter to Grief podcast host. If this is your first time, please hit the follow button. And if you're a returning listener, welcome back. Today, we have with us Nichole Haugen. She's a wife, a mom of 6 girls, a nurse, and a certified life coach. Nichole, thank you so much for being with us. How are you?
Yeah, I'm great. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. So I connected with Nichole on TikTok. Shocker. Everyone in the world is on TikTok. So I saw your page and I was like, oh my goodness, she seems so educated when it comes to grief, and like a lot of the things that you posted I found to be really helpful. So I thought you would be a great guest to have on the show. So can you just kind of give us just a little bit of your background of how you kind of got into being a life coach and what is your connection to grief?
Yeah, so back in 2019, both of my parents passed away. My dad was an expected death. He had lived with cancer for 10 years. And in that spring, we knew it was kind of progressing. So we got him signed up for hospice. And at the time, I was actually working as a hospice nurse. And then, so that was hard, but also bittersweet, right? He wasn't in pain anymore. And then that December, so like 4.5 months later, my mom missed her turn coming into her driveway. It was storming out and she accidentally drove out into water, thinking that she was turning into her driveway, and her car went under the water. We didn't realize till the following day when my brother's like, hey, have you seen mom? Like, she's missing. And so he called the authorities, and it took a few days to find her car in the water, and then a few other days to find her body because she had tried to get out of the vehicle and get out.
Wow.
And so all of that was extremely hard and tragic. I had just had my 6th child about 6 weeks before my dad passed away. And about a month after my mom died then, I realized or found out that my husband had been spending money that I didn't know about, had racked up thousands of dollars in credit card debt, buying collectibles and baseball cards and all the things. So yes, I have a lot of experience in grief, just being on the side professionally with hospice and caring for people's loved ones that are dying, also personally, and then also grief like in marriage, or when you are grieving an expectation that you thought was going to be and no longer is. And so after all of this has kind of happened, then of course it was 2020, so everything shut down. And I was just like, something has got to give. I need some help. I need something. And I originally found life coaching to lose weight. And so I was like, okay, like that's what's going to get me healthy and going. And so I lost 40 pounds fairly quickly. So that was great. But through that, I realized how much grief I was still holding and carrying around, how much resentment, how much anger. And so that's kind of how then I became a grief coach, is to help other people through that.
Wow. You just said a lot. Wow.
Yeah.
My goodness. I can imagine, like, professionally, like you're a hospice nurse. You've been trained to help families process one of the toughest things that they're going to go through. And I can only imagine how complicated that has to be professionally when you're on the other side of it. So how do you feel like your professional side helped you when it was your own family that you're having to help through this process?
Yeah, I do think that professionally as a nurse, like, there's a lot of times where you have to compartmentalize things and just like, you're sad for the family. Maybe you really were close to this patient and you have to keep showing up for other families, right? You still have to go home and show up for your family. And so part of that helped me deal with it. It helped me learn how to cope kind of in the moment and allow those feelings, even when I didn't maybe realize I was doing that.
Mm-hmm.
It helped me understand from the flip side of it, like what my siblings were going through as our parents were dying and died and passed away, it really helped me understand that most people struggle with death and are not okay with it and don't want to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I realized, like, I'm kind of unique in that way, that I wouldn't say I like death. I mean, I don't
Mm-hmm.
think any of us like death, but I have seen death be so beautiful that really helped me as well.
Wow. I agree. I feel like a lot of people don't talk about it, or maybe they don't even know how to talk about it. So that was really one of the things that really energized my ideal of this podcast, because I do want to change the way people think about grief, process grief, and talk about it. And so I feel like the hardest part about grief for me, and I've dealt with it from so many different areas, was always just the coming to terms with what is. And so I feel like you being a hospice nurse, you've probably seen so many families through this transition. What are the tools that you feel like you could help someone that's very early on in their grief process?
Mhm. Yeah, I think the biggest thing when you're early on is just to realize that it's okay, right? First and foremost, just to try to have compassion for yourself. I mean, there's going to be days where like you're just snapping at everybody around you and like upset and you really don't know why, but you
Mm-hmm.
just are. And so I'm not saying to like that it's okay that we do that, but just to be like, oh, yeah, like I forgot my dad's birthday is next week. And once I looked at
Mm-hmm.
the calendar, it's like, oh, yep, that's what's happening right now. So, like, to just recognize that. I think the other thing that is extremely helpful for me is when we start to feel those emotions, to give it a name, to say,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I'm angry right now. Oh, like, I'm really resentful that I didn't get more time. Like, oh, I'm just like, I am overwhelmed because I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to plan my daughter's birthday party, but I'm also sad because I'm sad my parents aren't going to be here. Just to name it. And just naming it feels like we have more control over it then. It gives us something to hold on to.
Wow. I love that, because I went to grief counseling recently, and I was telling my grief counselor I was having all these weird emotions. My daughter's it's her senior year, and I said I just can't stop crying. And she was like, "Well, you have to keep in mind," and she was telling me things I hadn't thought about. And she was saying, even though you don't realize the dates, she's like, your heart and your mind has a calendar. And
Mm-hmm.
even when you don't even realize it, that's what's happening. And so I absolutely agree. Like, sometimes just giving yourself a little bit of grace. Like you say, it's not okay that you're lashing out, or you're, like you say, labeling these feelings of what you're feeling, but it's grief. It's always attached to grief. You're angry, but you're grieving.
Mm-hmm.
You're overwhelmed because of the grief. You're sad because of the grief. So I love that. And just hearing you put that into words, I think is going to be so helpful for a lot of people, because sometimes you're trying to sort out, like, what is wrong with me. I
Mm-hmm.
find myself doing that all the time. Like, oh my god, like I'm like just in just a rage. I'm like, what in the world is wrong? And then I look at my calendar, like, oh, it's our anniversary weekend next week, or it will be my dad's birthday. So I love that you say that. Being that you're a hospice nurse and you are able to help families like when they're preparing for death, I always feel like people who get a warning that is happening, I always feel like, oh, it may be a little easier for them because they know it's coming. Do you feel like have you noticed that makes it easier for people, or what has been your experience with the time frame?
I think yes and no. I think the people that are accepting
Mm-hmm.
of what they see in front of them, that yeah, I have this time, I'm going to use it, I'm going to visit with them, I'm going to say my goodbyes. I think when people are accepting,
Mm-hmm.
that then it is, I would say, quote unquote easier,
Mm-hmm.
um in a way. Of course there's still that grief, but I would say that you don't have the unexpectedness of it on top
Mm-hmm.
of the grief. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, it is a little bit easier. But I have seen also where there's people who, you know, you can tell the family these things are happening. We're seeing this, they're progressing, they're getting closer to end of life, maybe have a few weeks. And some people are just in denial.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that then also kind of adds their own unexpected death on top of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are some of the benefits? Because I'm sure there's people that listen to this podcast who may be years after losing someone in their life and not even realizing that they're still grieving. What do you feel like are the benefits for someone to go and talk to someone, grief counseling, or seek a grief coach or a life coach? What are the benefits of that you found?
Yeah, the biggest benefit is just to have it out in the air, out in the open. We have over 40,000 thoughts a day. And so when we have 40,000 thoughts, our brain is always trying to keep us safe and seek pleasure and not exert energy. And so our brain is always telling us a lot of negative things. And so not only are we grieving, but then our brain adds on top of it. It adds these negative things such as you should be over this, you like, what's your problem? You should be moved on. And then on top of that, also, that's what the world tells us too. People who are very well-meaning say things that are very unhelpful. And so that adds on top of that hurt and that pain. And sometimes we just really don't feel like we have any place to turn to. We don't want to keep burdening our family or loved ones with like, hey, I'm still struggling with this. And it's been 3 years. It's been 7 years. And like, I'm still hurt and angry. And so I do see the benefit of that is probably the biggest benefit is just a place where you come to where you don't have somebody trying to make you feel better. Mm-hmm. You don't have somebody saying, well, I know, but they're in a better place. Like, okay, but that's not helpful. That's not helpful to hear. It makes you feel worse. And so when you come to a coach, it's a space where you just are allowed to be you. You're allowed to have whatever emotions you're having, whatever is coming up in that moment, in the past week, whatever might be coming up. Like you're just allowed to be in that space.
Right. I personally started grief counseling. It was very early on. And I will tell anyone, I feel like it was my saving grace. I don't know how I could have made it through my beginning grief journey without it. The benefits were endless for me. But I've also heard people say that they've struggled trying to find the right person to talk to. Are there any pointers that you would give someone that's listening? Maybe they've reached out and tried to find someone, or they met with someone, it didn't work out. Are there any like tips to finding the right person or like tools that you would offer for someone in that process?
Yeah, so I would say just to kind of talk through the therapist versus counselor versus coach scenario, first of all, is I like to compare it to a therapist is like a doctor, a counselor is like a physical therapist, and then a coach is like a personal trainer. And so if you have a broken leg, you're not going to be going to a personal trainer for help. You're going to go to a doctor. And so there's just very clear boundaries around, hey, like I maybe have some diagnosis already, and now I have grief on top of that. I'm going to reach out to a therapist. Or, you know what, like I just really want to get through this grief process. I really don't know how. I don't even know if I am allowing emotions or if I'm so, like trying to like get through the grief. Then I would say reach out maybe to like a coach, because that's more of like a personal trainer, right? You're just trying to get a little bit of help, trying to like manage the situation. And so that's kind of the difference between those. And then I would always say like a lot of places, it's okay to start and then stop. If it doesn't mesh well, if you don't like the personality or the things that they're even saying to you, if you find it very unhelpful, it's okay to quit. I always say no is a complete sentence. And so you can just say, nope, that was not my person. I'm going to go look for somebody else. There's a lot of support groups online. You can reach out to people and say, hey, I'm in this area. Does anybody know of a good
Mm-hmm.
therapist, counselor, or coach in this area? And then I would also say, if you're still unsure, a lot of coaches, especially, like, a lot of us have free consults. And so if you come on and we're like, no, I think you need a little bit more help than what I can give you,
Mm-hmm.
like, I recommend a therapist. And most of us have some in our back pocket or some place that you can go find that help.
Wow. You know, I think it's so interesting. The reason I share the same thing that you said earlier. Like, it's not that I enjoy talking about grief, but I find it so empowering that
Mhm.
I'm always learning things, and there's these little nuggets of things that I hear that I'm like, oh my god, that makes so much sense. So just hearing you explain the difference, because I'm sure there's someone listening that probably thought all of those things was one person, and
Mhm.
so just hearing the way you explained that was really perfect. And I remember I was talking to my grief counselor, and she talked about, I was explaining to her how hard of a time I was having. And she was like, well, how are you resting? And I was like, what do you mean? I was like, what? I'm thinking to myself, what does it have to do with anything? Like, I'm not. And she was like, well, that's the problem. She said, you do realize that the grief that you're experiencing, the loss that you just took, is trauma. And she said, you wouldn't expect yourself to be walking the next day after you break your leg. So why are you expecting yourself to be emotionally okay the next day after your heart being broken? And I remember when she said that, it was just like this sense of like almost like a weight take off of my shoulder to hear her say that, because that's true. People try to rush you through this process, and we talk about bereavement at work. You get 3 days, depending on if it's a close relative. God forbid it's just a cousin.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, you don't get time for that. And it's like it's this society, this idea that we're supposed to just process things and move on so quickly. So I agree with that wholeheartedly. Like, understanding that it is a process and that you do need to give yourself time to deal with it, and just understanding that there's different levels of your trauma, and depending on
Mhm.
maybe where you are and how much you've processed and how much help you need, deciding which one of those professionals would be best for you to talk to. And the reason I really was so when I connected with you, I was like, oh my god, I'm sure there's so many people that will hear this, because I know you offer services virtual. And so even if they're not in your area, like maybe they will hear this podcast and be like, oh my gosh, like, I maybe just, like you say, you just need a trainer. You just need to, you need to lose a couple of pounds. You just need to go to the gym a couple of days. So it's like now someone can hear this and be like, oh, maybe I just need to talk to a coach, and just a little bit of help to get me up in the morning, get a little motivation to get started. So just if there's someone listening, maybe just tell us the benefits of, I mean, I know you talked about it a little bit, but just like the benefits of talking with you one on one as a grief coach. How can that be beneficial?
Yeah. So what I do is I really help you wade through the grief waters,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's really just that support and, like I said, allowing those emotions where other places it feels like you have to hide them, or kind of put on a brave front if you're going to go places. I also give very practical tips, like if you're, I mean, the holidays are coming up, and so there's going to be a lot of events, a lot of parties, and even like with my mom, when I see my aunts, that triggers grief sometimes because they look
Yeah.
like her, they talk like her mannerisms. Same with my dad, his my uncle looks almost like just similar, and you can see them in your other loved ones, and
Mm-hmm.
that can bring up some triggers. And so just practical things of, okay, like, do you even feel like you want to go to the
Mm-hmm.
event, for one? Because you can say no. If you do, telling other people how they can support you, having kind of an escape plan where you can say, okay, like, hubby, like, if I say this word, like, that means we're going to wrap it up, start gathering the kids. I got to
Mm-hmm.
go. Just those simple things also. And a lot of it is also the self-care aspect, because we're so used to just taking care of everybody else around
Mm-hmm.
us. that we forget that we need that care also. You know, when a child is sick, you're like, yeah, I'll give you medicine and here you need to rest. Well, we don't think of grief that way. And so
Mm-hmm.
really, I probably just need some rest. I need water. I need maybe some healthy food, just simple things like that to work through. Just very practical things.
Yeah, I agree. And definitely with the holidays coming up, I talk about it all the time. Like, I kind of dread November because it's like, oh, here we go. Like, because it's the jump start to all the holidays. And I've I always try to think of like happy things to try to focus on. I try to do new traditions. What are some tools that you feel like can help people through the holidays?
Mhm. Yeah, I think first and foremost, like knowing what things will trigger you or might
Hmm.
trigger you. And so then those can be more expected triggers. So you can either avoid them or have
Hmm.
things that, hey, if I'm going to see this, this is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to respond.
Hmm.
Um, the other things that are maybe unexpected, right? Like you're in a store and all of a sudden you see your dad's favorite Christmas candy and you're like you're just bawling, right? Like,
Hmm.
and so I think too, just to one, say that this is normal, it's okay, because then we feel embarrassed on top of it and we
Hmm.
feel kind of shamed, like, oh my gosh, like I hope nobody sees me. I think just to one, just be like, nope, like I'm just gonna cry here in Home Goods and that's just what it is today. Like I'm
Yeah.
just gonna cry. So maybe just even like having some extra tissues with just those simple things of just knowing that things will come up, and
Right.
that's okay. And I think just to like allow that, and I think the other thing too is when we don't plan for it,
Hmm.
we plan for the expected, right? Like my
Right.
mom, so like technically she died on December 8th. They found her body on the 9th, and then December 12th was or no, they found her car on the 9th and then her body on the 12th. So like
Wow.
those 3 days, I I always take the day off work. Like those are
Hmm.
the expected. But then when the unexpected things come up, we're just like, oh my gosh, like what? Like like an unexpected grief came up. Like
Right.
what? I think it's like just to expect the unexpected, that there will be
Right.
things that you really honestly just can't prepare for. And you'll be
Hmm.
like, whoa, I was not expecting that. And you'll be like, oh yeah, remember we kind of knew unexpected things would come up. And this is one of them. So next time I'm going to plan this way.
Yeah. I think you made a very great point because there are these moments that grief hits you, and it's that it's not expected. And I think it really made me think of something else. Like with the holidays approaching, we need to be kinder to each other because you never know what the person that's at the checkout line is dealing with. They could be battling losing their mother weeks before, or the holidays could be extra hard for them because this is when like these moments are happening and they're being triggered. So just as a reminder to anyone that's listening, even if you're not personally going through your own grief journey, just try to remember to be a little more kind to one another because you never know what somebody's going through. You may be, somebody may be a little confused and they're working in customer service or the service industry, and you're getting upset with this person thinking that they're messing up your order or they didn't do the right thing with something that you're asking them, and you don't know what phone call they just received the day before. You don't know what they're battling. And so I think just hearing you talk about our own triggers is just being more aware that people are dealing with things around the holidays, and it's tough for a lot of people. So I want us to just be more kind to each other and kind to ourselves. You talk about self-care, and we do need to take care of ourselves, but we need to also take care of each other. With that being said, are there things that you feel like we can do for one another in our grief journeys to make it easier to help each other out?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that one thing, a big part is for me, what I help people with is knowing what you really truly need help with
Hmm.
so you can vocalize that to others,
Hmm.
and in a very specific way. Because a lot of times, like my husband wanted to help me, through my grief, but he's never really, I mean, he's lost a few grandparents,
Mm-hmm.
but they were older, and so he honestly just had no experience with it. And when I was struggling and I didn't know how to communicate, then it would just kind of escalate into then, okay, we're fighting on top of I'm overwhelmed, on top of really I'm grieving.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think just to be very clear with communications, I think also, people, again, people mean well, they say things that aren't really helpful, and to just be compassionate towards them as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to just think like, oh, like how nice that they don't know. They don't know what I'm going through. Like,
Yeah.
Just to have compassion that like they haven't been there yet.
Right.
And then to also like know that, hey, well, like when they are struggling, I know what it's like.
Mm-hmm.
So I can be there for them.
Right.
And so I think that's just kind of to just know that we all experience grief at
Mm-hmm.
some point, but we're all kind of on a different level in our journey, and that's okay.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. Um, are there any myths that you feel like we can kind of like help people through when it comes to grief counseling or grief coaching? Are there any myths that you feel like you can kind of help us get away from?
Yeah, I think that a big one is when people are like, that we just kind of tell ourselves, like, well, I should be over this or I should be past it. And I think also others around us also think that. And I think that is a big myth is like, this grief is with you forever now. You may be able to cope a little bit better at times. It does get a little easier with time, but it's just with you always. And so I think that's a myth of, well, they should be over it by now.
Mm-hmm.
I also think it's a myth of, oh, they've moved on too fast, right? Like, because we don't know what that person's going through. Maybe they have grieved and processed all these emotions and they're ready. Like, who's to say that, if you've lost a spouse, that you're not ready in 8 months to move on? I mean, there is no timeline on any of it. So I would say on both sides of the coin is there's really no timeline.
Mm-hmm.
I also think another myth that I don't know so much as a myth, but I see a lot of people saying, well, if you need anything, just let me know. To me, a big thing that helps other people is if you say, hey, I know that this happened. Would you like, and give 3 options, right? Would you like me to order a meal for you? Would you like me to come mow your lawn? Do you want me to pick up your kids from anything? I mean, just give
Mm-hmm.
then it doesn't have to be those kinds of things, but, or even, hey, would it be helpful? I'm going to get you a massage. Like, where's your favorite massage place? I know that you haven't had time, but I want you to go get your nails done. Like, I got you this thing. So just to give specific things, because when somebody is grieving, little choices are so overwhelming
Mm-hmm.
that we know people want to help, but it just puts more pressure
Mm-hmm.
on when you don't know what to say. And you're just like, okay, thank you, but I'm just going to continue struggling on my own.
Right. I love that. And I always talk about that. Like there's these little things that throughout my grief journey that stand out. And it was a lot of them were very small things. And I love that instead of saying, what can I do? Offer a couple of things that you can do. And I think that's
Mhm.
perfect. Like I always tell people, it's the things that you need done. You're at the grocery store and you're picking up toiletries. Well, they need toiletries. Your next door neighbor, you're taking your trash to the end of the road. Their trash has to be picked up. Just like little things that we can do that are so simple, but to someone that's going through grief, that those little things mean a lot. So I do appreciate you for saying that, and I hope that anyone listening, and it's like you said, um, there's a almost like a sense of like peace for people who've never gone through grief, but then a bit of sadness because you do realize at some point, thank God you don't get it, but like a little
Mhm.
sadness that eventually you will. And it's like you say, and when they do get it, you want to be the person on the receiving end that's able to help them. So that definitely resonated with me. Um, how do you feel like people can get the most out of seeking professional help when it comes to their grief?
Yeah, I think part of it is just kind of putting in the work, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's grief is just it is physical, right? Like you feel physically tired, you feel
Mm-hmm.
physically drained, but it is so emotional and mental. And so putting in the work of, if your coach says, "Hey, like I really want you this week for 20 minutes every day just to lay down and rest." Or I
Mm-hmm.
really encourage you to just try to get in 32 ounces of water every day, basic needs. Or if your therapist recommends something, I like to really try and put in the work, because grief is one of those things that we can get support, we can get help, but we can't do the work for other people. And
Mm-hmm.
that is also to be said for a lot of other things, right? Like with weight loss or healthy eating habits, or if somebody's addicted to their phone, like we can see that,
Mm-hmm.
but we can't do the work for them. And so just really knowing that it is hard, it is very hard, but that there's hope on the other side.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And just kind of to go back with your own beginning journey with grief with your parents. You say your father, you guys knew it was happening because you were going through hospice with him. How was your mother's? How did your mother process all of that?
Yeah, I don't think she was processing it much at the time. I mean, she knew it was happening.
Mm-hmm.
They were able to talk about his final wishes, where he wanted to be buried, what songs he wanted at his funeral, those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
But I saw her a lot just being busy. Like she
Mm-hmm.
barely sat down. If she did sit down, she'd play like solitaire on the computer, or like mahjong tiles or something, to keep her just busy, busy, busy,
Mm-hmm.
busy work. And then even after he died, I saw her. She was still working, so she'd gone back to work, and just busy all the time. And so I saw her doing that a lot. And unfortunately, I don't think she had much time to process it and to grieve. And, in a way, it's unfortunate, but it's also fortunate because she doesn't have to suffer with that anymore. But yeah, just keeping herself very busy and not, I mean, I think she would eat at times, but it was just kind of snacking here and there. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't sitting down for like a meal or taking time. And there were a lot of people coming and going, visiting my dad. And so she would always be hospitality, like
Mm-hmm.
food and beverages for them. And so looking back, it's like I see that was how she coped with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and just speaking of coping, I think we all have these little ways that we try to cope with grief. For me, in the very beginning, it was I remember the night after my husband passed away. I sat down and I was trying to process what I was feeling, and I typed a Facebook post. It's really how my book series even got started. I typed a letter, and it was dear husband, and I just wrote about like just how I felt and everything I was feeling. And for me, the coping was always writing. I just found a sense of peace of just getting it out of my head and typing it out on my phone and putting it somewhere. That really helps me process with my grief. What are some ways, healthy ways, that you feel like people can cope with grief?
Yeah, I do. I always recommend writing a letter to somebody, especially if there is some anger, resentment,
Mm-hmm.
those kinds of feelings come up also. Writing letters. I know also for my mom, I should say she would pray a lot.
Mm-hmm.
She's very faithful. And so praying, reaching out to friends. If you do have somebody in your group or friend that has experienced grief,
Mm-hmm.
to talk to them. I know for me, I would reach out to my cousins a lot. Their brother died when he was 15 very suddenly. And so they understood, and they knew, especially with the sudden death, like all those feelings, all the emotions, holidays, birthdays,
Mm-hmm.
anniversaries. So if you do have somebody that you can talk to, talking can help. If you like to do some sort of creative hobby, drawing, a lot of those things are good outlets, or even just going for a walk. A lot of times, if I start to feel very overwhelmed, very stressed, I'm just like, it's been a while since I've been outside. I'm just going to get outside for a little bit, breathe some fresh air, take in nature, and if you don't have a space that you have a lot of outside area, even maybe buying some plants or something that kind of
Mm.
brings some joy, but it's a living thing that just brings life into your environment.
Yeah, I love that. So, because my book is called Love Letter to Grief Learning to Walk by Faith. Funny that you say that because that's what I was doing. Like in the very beginning, I was walking literally. I would go walking for like miles. And I would just say to myself, just one foot in front of the next, one step in front, one step to the next. And I was just telling myself, like, just literally walk by faith. And I remember I would every day I would walk and I would post a picture. I would hashtag walk by faith, but I was like physically doing it. And it was just something that, and I agree with you, it's just something about being outside. I was able to have these conversations with God because I've always been very heavy in my faith. And the walking, literally walking by faith, was something that really, really helped me. So I know not everyone is super spiritual and may not be, their faith may not be as strong, but you talked about your mom's faith. Do you feel, how was your faith journey going through what you went through?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, like my faith carried me through.
Mm-hmm.
It's what I relied on. My mom would always say, especially when my dad was dying, she's always just like, Jesus, I trust in you. And it was just like a short little prayer where you can just like, like, okay, I don't understand. I don't know why. And to just give it to Jesus. And so that phrase helped me a
Mm-hmm.
lot through all of that.
Right.
Um, and just, yeah, to just know that I don't have all the answers, and that's okay too.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't know. And I also, there's been times, I mean, our priest recommended this. He's like, God already knows you're angry. So it's okay to like tell him that. So I did. I took that to heart, and a time when my kids were not around, I just took time and I was mad at God for a while, and I just like told him all the things, all the anger I had,
Mm-hmm.
how resentful I was, how angry I was my mom wasn't around, how angry I was my kids don't, some of them don't remember them. And so just to like, again, allowing those emotions, right? Like
Right.
whether, like specifically God or whatever your faith or spiritual journey is, like just allowing that, and
Mm-hmm.
not holding it in.
Yeah. I think it's very helpful because we often hear, you're not supposed to question God. Everything happens for a reason, all the cliches that we hear. Ugh. It's like, yeah, but here we are. And so I think that's it's such an honest thing. And I want us to just change our thought process and to stop putting so much pressure on ourselves that we can't be frustrated or we can't be upset, or like you say, label these emotions, label what you're feeling. I think that's a healthy thing for that. Some people are having a hard time with that. Now as a hospice nurse, I'm sure I mean, I can't say I'm sure, but I would imagine that you may have met with families that weren't very spiritual, weren't strong in faith. Have you encountered people through that process that don't have a foundation of faith going through grief?
Yeah. And I mean, for me, I kind of recognize that I do feel like it is a little bit harder for people
Mm-hmm.
because you don't know. It just feels like the unknown. Like, well,
Mm-hmm.
we're all going to die, but then what? And so, I mean, I do think that again might be a little bit more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's especially where I would recommend like reaching out to somebody to talk through those things, and just again processing those feelings. And I think that is also 100% human and 100% normal when somebody dies to still question, even if you do have faith, to just be
Right.
like, well, like that's what I've always believed, but now it's really being put to the test. And so
Right.
again, just recognizing that is normal, just so normal and so human, and that's okay.
Yeah. Because I'm sure that we have people that are listening to this podcast who maybe very early in their grief process, and they're having a very hard time understanding their place right now with their faith, if they were faithful before, or just their questioning of God of why their family member, why their person. Because and sometimes it's like death can come to us in some of the most heartbreaking ways. I mean, even how you spoke about how your mom passed. I mean, to someone who's super faithful, is like, wow, like that, just the surrounding emotions of how a person passes and why a person endures the things they have to endure. So I'm sure there are people who are listening that are like, you know what, I understand that because that's where I am right now. So I think what we're saying, I pray, resonates with someone that even in that dark moment where they're feeling like no one can understand it and they can't even understand it, I pray that they find some safe space or some safe person that offers them a safe space to talk about their grief and to process what they're going through and work through it. So I really want us to, just like I say, I want us to change the way we talk about grief and how we process it, because everyone is not, everyone wasn't raised in church and they didn't hear scriptures, and their parents aren't saying, Jesus, I trust you. So to those people that are walking a different journey, I pray that even those people understand that this this journey will not be the end of them, and they will get through it. Even in getting through it, it may not feel like they're finding a sense of understanding, but just I hope that we can offer them that it is going to get easier. And each day that they continue to get stronger, they will find ways to just maintain and ways to continue to push through. So I really hope that message reaches the person it needs to reach today, for sure. Are there any messages that you would like to share with someone that's in their grief journey?
I think just one of the biggest things, and I mean, it really does suck, but time
Mm-hmm.
does help. We are a culture of very immediate gratification. We want things done right now, and that's not how grief is. And it just sucks. It really does. And so just to again reassure you, like, you're not crazy. This is as hard as you think it is, and it sucks.
Mm-hmm.
But it does get better.
Yeah. That's true. I was speaking with someone and they were like, I want to do the podcast, but I don't know what I would even write in my love letter to grief. And I said, well, what do you want to say to grief? And it's perfect what you just said. Your love letter to grief may be just that: grief, you suck, because it does.
Yeah.
And just from there, you can just talk about, like, the person that you lost and why the loss hurts so much. Because I always tell people, we always talk about how a person passed away, but I want us to also focus on why the passing of this person hurts so much, because it's not just about how we lost them, but like why we love them. So with that being said, there's people out here who did not get the honor of meeting your father. And there's people who unfortunately did not get the honor of meeting your mom. So can you share with us what we missed out on by not meeting them?
Yeah. So my dad was very stubborn. He was a rancher his whole life. He was actually born on the farmstead that he lived and raised us. And yeah, he always tried to be fair and kind, though. And my mom, she was a very faithful person. I look up to her. She's a role model. She worked at our local prison with sex offenders, and I just have much admiration for the work and the stories she heard and the grief in that way that she
Mm.
helped them every day. And she also was very opinionated, very you didn't always have to abide by what she thought, but she was going to let you know what she thought. And people tell me I'm very much like my mom. So again, I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing.
I love that. And you spoke about your siblings. I had a guest on earlier. She has 9 siblings. and she talked about losing her mom and how oftentimes siblings, if they lose a parent, they feel like there's like almost this like we're going to grieve together. And she talked about how even though you do share the loss of who you lost, how it's so individual. Can you speak about that maybe briefly, just about how you know if you did notice any difference in like how you and your siblings processed it?
Yeah. So I have an older sister and then a younger brother. And um, I would say for my brother, especially when my dad died, I noticed that he seemed to want to take on the father role of the family. And then
Mm,
especially after my mom passed, it was like that was his way of grieving, was like, I'm going to help care for you guys. I'm gonna like
mhm.
almost like step up in ways that like no, it's okay. Like we got
Yeah.
like we're adults still. It's okay.
Mhm.
And I think my sister, she just internalizes things a lot more. She doesn't talk about it, and which is her own way, that's okay
Mhm.
too. Sometimes she would talk about things, or for her, it's a lot of, if she hears a song, she'll always text us and be like, oh, I heard this song, I thought of dad, or,
Oh,
I always saw this and thought of mom. And so, but otherwise, anytime you talk about sadness or grief, she tries to quickly change the subject. So,
yeah.
so that's just kind of where we're all different in that way
Mhm.
as well, even though, yeah, it was the same experience, but very different from our own point of view.
Right. I have to remind myself of that often. So professionally, well, I went to college. I went to college and I got a degree in a social worker. And so I think I always had like that sense of empathy for people and wanting to help people. But I quickly transitioned into being a wedding planner. And I did that professionally for 12 years full time. And I always talked about I was like my ministry in life is love. I always felt that way. And I just enjoyed being the person that other people trusted to be a part of all their special moments, like baby showers and bridal showers and weddings. I've always talked about, oh, my ministry in life is love. And the second I lost my husband, I was like, yeah, I think my ministry in life is going to be different. And then I realized it in talking to my grief counselor. She was like, yeah, but your ministry didn't change. Like your ministry of love is still the same. Like you talk about grief because the love. And I was like, yeah, like that makes sense. So I find myself really in a space where I want to just be a safe space for people to talk about their grief and talk about the love because they are the same exact thing to me. Like I always say, grief is love without anywhere to go, without anyone to talk to about it. So I've definitely, as I've transitioned from one area to the next, I think it's still the same thing. So with you being a nurse who initially started in hospice and going through such a tough situation yourself and grieving both your parents and now helping other people process their grief. Do you feel like your position has changed any, or do you kind of feel like they kind of blend together?
I think a lot of it blends together. I think as a nurse, you are kind of helping people. I mean, in any area of nursing, but especially in
Mm-hmm.
hospice, like you're helping them kind of live out the final love, like here on earth, like in those final moments, final days. And now as a grief coach, it's like grief is evidence of love. Like that's why we grieve. And so, yeah, I do think that they coincide a lot together. And yeah, I love that. I, again, I wouldn't have chosen this path to get here.
Right,
Obviously, none of us
exactly.
would. But, I do see the beauty of God's hand in it and
Yeah,
how this is my calling.
yeah. And also, it's almost like an honor that God has trusted you to be a part of so many people's that part of their life. And like I can't even imagine like the people that you've helped professionally and that you're going to continue to help by being a safe space for people to talk about their loved ones. So I think, just seeing the transition professionally, I think has to be both rewarding but probably still somewhat overwhelming.
Mhm. Yeah.
So do
And
you
when you talk with grief a lot, it gets heavy,
mhm,
right? You hold it near to your heart as well. But yes, it is very, both nurse and this is it's very rewarding.
yeah. So is there anything that you so is there anything that you when you were helping other families through hospice, I'm sure there's plenty of things that you offered them pointers and things to get ready for grief and how to handle it. Is there anything that you learned personally that you wish you had known earlier that would have helped you process it yourself?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that just understanding how mentally and physically exhausting it is. Like, I think if I would have known that earlier, I think I would have, in those first days, especially, like, maybe handled things a little bit better.
Mhm.
Maybe not just felt like I mean, maybe not, right? Like, I mean, the way my mom died was so tragic that it was just, you were basically just surviving basic needs, just
Mhm.
making sure the kids got where they needed to go. Like, I do wish that I would have known how to talk to my kids about grief a little bit more.
Mm.
So I try to help people with that a lot because that is one thing that it feels very heavy. And when
Mhm.
you're struggling yourself, you don't want to put any hurt on your kids ever.
Right.
And unfortunately, this is something that will hurt them. And so just to kind of walk through that and how to handle that in the
Mhm.
best possible way.
Yeah. That's true. And I mean, I think about like my dad passed away and I think he was so much he was he was a dad to me, but as a granddad, it's like a different type of love. And so I the heartbreak for your kids because it's like there's nothing better than a grandparent, like especially the good ones, And so it is really tough to kind of even think about those conversations. So are there any pointers that you can not like of course like I said before, I pray that someone is listening to this podcast that hears what you do for professionally and reaches out. And I think for sure it will be something that people can benefit from. So I don't want you to give away everything, but are there any pointers that you would say to someone that's talking to a child about loss? Are there any easy things that you could say this makes it a little easier?
Mhm. Yeah, I think first and foremost, just being honest with them.
Mm-hmm.
Just saying, like, I don't necessarily know what's going to happen in the upcoming days, but I will try to keep you as informed. And then talking to them where they're at, right? Like, talking to a toddler is different than talking to a teenager. Um, so just like saying it in ways that they understand and giving them as much
Mm-hmm.
information as they really can handle or need to know.
Mm-hmm.
I think, again, just being honest. And I think then, especially like the following days,
Mm-hmm.
I wish I would have communicated better with my
Mm-hmm.
children about this is what I'm going through. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
sorry if I'm a little bit more angry and short. And, I know you have emotions too. Like, how are you
Right.
feeling? And allowing them space to talk through it, especially my few that were a little bit older, allowing them space to talk and allowing that, like, to know that maybe they don't want to talk. Maybe they want to draw. Maybe they just need a
Mm-hmm.
hug, because we all grieve differently. And to
Yeah.
recognize which ways that maybe my kids grieve in their different ways and allowing that. And then one thing that I do, I'm like, when people say, "Oh, grandma's just sleeping," like,
Mhm.
no, grandpa died. Like, it's
Yeah.
just his body here. He doesn't hurt anymore. Like, just talking like that, I think is a
Mm-hmm.
big thing to, again, just be honest with them.
Yeah. I think we forget how resilient kids are sometimes.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we don't give them enough credit. And I agree with you, just being honest, but meeting them where they are. Of course, you wouldn't give the news to a 2-year-old the way you would a teenager. And I know for me, I talked about my husband a lot. Like it just brought me such like happiness to talk about him. But I quickly understood that my daughter, who lost her dad when she was 10, and my stepson, who was 17 when his dad passed away, um, they grieved completely different from me. And so I quickly understood that Whereas I always wanted to talk about it, they didn't. And so I think just understanding that, like you say, just meeting them where they are is very beneficial. And just being a safe space for if they want to talk about it, allow them to talk about it. Don't try to force it. And I know when I was going to grief counseling, I was, of course, doing I was talking about him 24/7. But with my daughter, it was like you say, arts and crafts, and they were doing music and doing all these different things that to someone else, you probably thinking, well, how is this even helping? But you meet them where they are. And so the things that kids do naturally and that they enjoy doing, you do it with them. And then around those activities, her counselor was talking to her about the grief. And so it was really interesting to see how different they were with her than me. And it was completely separate. So she was able to have her little safe space to say things, because I do understand it was hard for her. Because with her, me and her being like the only two at home, she worried about me a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think for me as a parent, sometimes I would be like, okay, I don't want to be too emotional in front of her, but I also wanted to be real in front of her.
Mm-hmm.
So there were days where I would let her see me cry, because I was thinking to myself, I'm 37. And if I'm having such a hard time, how is this little brain of hers processing? And so I didn't want her to think, oh, I should be crying because mommy never cries. But I also didn't want her to be like, mommy falls apart every day. So I made sure there was a balance. So I did let her see me. Sometimes I would let her see that I was sad, or I would talk about it. And then I would also share with her the happy things too. So I think there's a balance. But I think what you said was perfect. You have to meet them where they are and understand, being honest and saying what needs to be said, and allowing them to kind of show you how much they can take and what they need from you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was very, very helpful, because it is hard. I remember the hardest thing for me was like, how do I even start this conversation? Like, how do you even deliver something like this to a child? But even so, are there cases where if someone reaches out, let's say someone is going through it right now, like it's just happened, would they be able to reach out to you and figure out how to have that conversation with their kids?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we can talk about, and again, it varies on like what age they are and kind of how they process things. A lot of like parents, which kid processes things differently, how to deliver the news, what things that you can have for support around them. Yeah, all those things.
Do you offer grief coaching for kids as well?
I haven't. I mean, I would think I could. I would recommend them being at least like teenage years. But yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And Nicole, do you mind sharing like your social media handles if anyone's listening to the podcast today and they want to reach out? How could they contact you?
Yeah, so I'm on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook, and it's Nurse Grief Coaching. And I also have a website, and that's where you can find like freebies and different things. nursegriefcoaching.com. And my YouTube channel as well has a lot of videos, tips, and things.
Amazing. So Nurse Grief Coaching.
Yep.
Easy peasy. So they can definitely find you that way. She made it easy. All the platforms are the same name. You got some people's like, oh, is this on TikTok? Well, here it's this. So that's a great way for them to contact you. But you have been so helpful today, just in the things that you've shared. I really appreciate your time. And like I in closing, I just want to say, I always want to, of course, grief can seem heavy, and there's a lot of emotions that come with it. There's a lot of tears a lot of times. But I do always want to leave each episode with something encouraging for people to hear, because I'm sure the reason a lot of you are here listening is because you're going through it. You're trying to process it. You're trying to figure out the next steps to life and living. So what words of encouragement would you have for someone going through grief?
Yeah, just that, it does take time, and that one day you will just realize like, oh, I was able to listen to that song and not cry.
Yeah.
And it really actually, instead of feeling such sadness,
Mm-hmm.
I actually felt a little bit of joy that my parents are that they're okay and that I love them, but I can start to live also.
Wow. I love that. And I agree. Like there are certain songs I could not listen to. It's like I can't hear that song. Turn it off.
Yeah.
And then every once in a while I hear a song and I shock myself. I get to the end. I'm like, okay, look at you. You listen to the whole song. So and
Yep.
music is very therapeutic for me. Like it's like every loss I've experienced, I have this one song that I just attach to that person. And it's just my go-to song that just either I listen to it and cry, or I listen to it and pray, or meditate, or it just makes me feel closer to them. So I love that you mentioned music. It was nice. Um I was trying to think if there was anything else I wanted to ask you, or is there anything else that you want to share, maybe that I haven't asked that you wanted to share while you were here?
I think you've covered a lot of it. Yeah. This was
I
great.
try. Well, again, thank you so much for being here. Again, guys, she gave you guys her social media handle. Can you give it to me one more time?
Yep. Nurse grief coaching.
Okay, so she's on TikTok, she's on Facebook, Instagram, she has a website. So hopefully, if you guys are listening and you're not sure where to start, this would be a great place to start. And like she said, there's different levels to where you are and what you need. But if you reach out to her, then she can definitely probably help you figure out if she's where you need, or if you need something more intense. But the the hope is that you guys understand that you don't have to go through this by yourself. There are professionals out here who are trained. And one thing about it for me, I feel like when you're talking to someone professional, a lot of times you don't want to feel like somebody's talking at you. Like, oh, I'm so certified. I have all these doctorates in this degree, and this is why. Trust me. But no, like it's not just a matter of you being a professional. You also understand this journey. And so that's like a different element of trust that that I would need in someone that I was reaching out to professionally, knowing that they've been through something so just as traumatic as my own loss. So I thank you for your vulnerability and sharing that with us, and I pray that your journey continues to get a little lighter as you continue to walk it.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. Um, This episode and all others can be found on YouTube channel, guys. Love Letters to Grieve. Thank you guys for listening. If there's anyone in your circle or yourself that's interested in penning a love letter to grieve or appearing on the podcast, you can contact me directly at lovelettertogrieve@gmail.com. And again, guys, this was our guest, Nichole Haugen, a wife, a mom of 6 girls, guys. Pray for her, a nurse, and a certified grief coach. Thank you so much for being here, Nichole.
Thank you so much.
All right. Yay.